Good morning. Today we are going to start our fixed income securities class for become 6th sem. Now this is for the next class we'll start our equity portions. Now this portion goes as goes is about bonds. What are the bonds and what is maturity date? Now bonds are issued by organizations generally for a period of more than 1 year to raise money by borrowing. This is essentially a borrowing instrument, and this instrument helps us in borrowing money from the public in general, and people who generally believe in a safe kind of investment can prefer bonds than equity investment. Now in case of bonds, the maturity date is a very important factor. The maturity date refers to the final date for the payment of any financial product when the principal along with the interest needs to be paid by to the investor by the issuer. Now at the date of maturity of the financial product, the principal must be paid back to the investor. The interest has to be paid back in all the years, for all the years that the bond has been issued, and the from up to the period when the bond is mature. Now the characteristics of a bond. A bond is generally a form of debt. That means a form of borrowing which the investors pay to the issuers for a defined time frame. That means, say, if the life of the bond is 5 years from issue to date of maturity, then the investors will pay to the issuers for interest for the 5 years and will pay back the principal at the end of the 5 years. And bondholders offer credit to the company. That is, the bondholders offer money in the form of credit to the company after issuing the bond. After issuing the bond. Now, characteristics of a bond. A bond generally have a fixed maturity date. Now, so a fixed maturity date, that means from after issue of 5 years, if it is issued on 1st of March 2019, then 2012, then it will mature for 5 years. It will mature on the 20th of February after 5 years. So this is on 2017. So this is a fixed maturity date. Now bonds repay the principal amount after the maturity date. However, some bonds do pay their interest along with the principal to the bondholder. There are different kinds of bonds that pay the principal. That every bonds have to pay the principal. Every bonds other than perpetual bonds have to pay the principal amounts to the principal after the maturity date. However, some bonds do pay the interest along with the principal to the bondholders. Now, if there is interest to be paid to the bondholders, then the interest is paid either biannually, that is 2 times a year, annually 1 time a year, or quarterly, that is 4 times a year. The interest is paid, but the total interest does not differ from the interest that is payable on the bond. Only the amount payable differs in installments. Now, type of bonds: fixed rate bonds. In case of fixed rate bonds, the interest remains fixed throughout the tenure of the bond. That means, say, if it's a 9% bond and an annual interest rate payable annually or semi-annually, you will get 9% interest on that particular bond payable annually or semi-annually. Now, the floating rate bonds, however, are different from the fixed rate bonds, a fluctuating interest rate as per the current market reference. Now, if, for example, if we talk in the case of housing loans, there's a fixed interest, there's a floating interest rate. Fixed interest rate housing loans, they carry a fixed charge on the loan, whereas floating interest rate depends on whether the market is open or closed, and the amount differs on the floating rate bonds. And they differ according to the current market, a reference of the current market situation. And the interest rate can be more than or less than the interest paid in the previous period. So there is an advantage to that bond if you pay less, than disadvantage to that bond if you pay more in comparison to fixed rate bonds. Now we are going to zero interest rate bonds. And zero interest rate bonds are specific bonds that do not pay any regular interest to the investors. Say you have purchased a 5-year zero interest rate bond, and say you are liable to pay, the company is liable to pay you 10% interest. Now, for 10% interest for 5 years, you have got rupees 1,000 into 5%, say rupees 50 per year into 5 years, that is 250. However, in zero coupon bonds, they will pay you, you have to pay rupees 750 when you are buying that bonds, and when you are selling that bond, you will get the full rupees 1,000. And however, you will not get the yearly annual interest payments. Now, in case of inflation-linked bond, bonds linked to inflation are called inflation-linked bond. Interest rate of inflation-linked bonds is generally lower than the fixed rate. Now, in case of inflation-linked bonds, if the inflation, the rate is lower than the fixed rate bond. However, the bond takes care into the regular inflation rate from the previous year to the current year and adjust the interest rate accordingly, so that the persons holding the bond, they do not have a very much open risk to the market. And the inflation linked bonds, they help us more in combating with the scenario of high rate inflation. However, the rates are less than the fixed rate bonds. Now, perpetual bonds. Now, perpetual bonds, a very good example of perpetual bonds is the Napoleonic bonds. Now, during when the period when Napoleon the Great and Great Britain were at war with each other, the Great Britain was very cash strapped, and they issued perpetual bonds. Means the bonds are never retireable. This is a very specific kind of a bonds in which the person who buys the bond never gets his money back. However, the interest is paid in perpetual to eternity. Means the person who has bought the bond, then his heirs or the person who owns the property of the bond, and then the next person who owns the property of that particular person gets the interest in perpetual throughout the life until the bond is retired by the government. Now, bearer bonds. The bearer bonds, however, are very risky bonds, as they do not carry the bond of the name of the bondholder, and anyone who possesses the bond certificate can claim the amount. Now, war bonds. War bonds are issued by any government to raise the funds in cases of war. Now, if there is a war between two countries and one country, like we had said, the Napoleonic Wars, England issued the perpetual bonds, then we can raise then the particular government of the country in war can raise the funds in case of war by war bonds. And serial bonds. Serial bonds are bonds that mature over a period of time in installments and are called serial bonds. The more specific example in this case would be sinking bonds redeemed by the method of sinking funds, and bonds that are not issued altogether. Say 1/3 of the bonds retire after every 2 years, and a sinking fund has been set up to retire the bonds. So every 2 years, 1/3 of the bonds will retire. That means they will 1/3 of the person holding 120 bonds, after every 2 years, he will get back the principal for the 40 bonds, and you will continue enjoying interest for the rest of the bonds. For the first 2 years, you will enjoy interest on 120 rupees bonds. For the next 2 years, after the end of 2 years, you will get back his 40 rupees, and then he will, for the next 2 years, you will enjoy interest on 80 rupees bonds, and after that, let's say 1/3 of 80 will be retired, and he will he will enjoy the get back the principal amount on that, and then he will get back the interest on the bonds after the next for the next years, and so on, until and unless all the bonds are retired in this manner. Thank you. This is the end of the class on bonds.